Hi, I'm licensed IO psychologist Dr. Clif P Lewis. Roll intro.
We don't want to get sued, so we're going to be like super vague. First mistake.
How are you a manager and unable to deal with conflict?
If nothing else, I'm balanced.
Welcome to Management Tool, the show where we talk about psychology, employment, and management, where my esteemed guests and I talk about why what you're doing is wrong. And today, beep beep, is that my Bessie and a Tessie? Fresh new job, senior elect. Ooh, she ready. Dr. Emily Yarrow. Hi, Emily.
Hi, Clifford. How are you today?
I am lovely. Thanks for being on the show. Well, show. Sounds so much more grand than it really is. So Emily is a dear friend of mine, but she is also a senior lecturer in management and organizations at Newcastle University Business School in the UK. Her research interests broadly include organizational theory, inequality regimes, and governance in higher education. To date, her contemporary research has focused on the impact of research evaluation on female academic careers, research impact, women's lived experiences in organizational life, and experiences of older workers in Scotland. So a lot of stuff that I am quite passionate about as well. Diversity and the lived experiences of marginalized groups in organizations, and as well as publishing in international top-tier journals such as Gender, Work and Organizations and Work, Employment and Society. Emily regularly contributes online blogs and other online media outlets. Outside of work at the university, Emily also conducts independent consulting work, and prior to returning to academia, Emily worked for Procter & Gamble as a buyer. So, as one might think, Emily and I will be talking about diversity today. And I'm super excited to be talking to you about this. Emily and I studied together. We did our PhDs together in the UK at Queen Mary University, and we have a lot of shared research interests. And today's focus is going to be specifically about diversity and inclusion in organizations post-COVID, which I think is a very interesting subfield of diversity and inclusion, and something that I haven't actually considered, but speaking to Emily before today, we thought that that would be an interesting topic. So thanks for joining again, Emily. So great to have you. Before we get into the roasting, I like to start the show off on a positive note, and with a little segment I call the Sharpest tool in the shed. And today's Sharpest tool in the shed is Rihanna. You are familiar with the pop icon that is Rihanna?
Yes.
So you know that Rihanna has branched out from music into fashion and makeup, and so very recently she launched Savage Savage x Fenty. So Fenty, long story short, is her surname. It is also the name of her makeup brand. And so I know Rihanna's maybe a bit problematic because she recently became a billionaire, but we're not going to get into that. We're going to focus on the positives. So she recently launched her, I think it was her fall line. What is it now in the United States? Fall, yes. So the Savage x Fenty line is Rihanna's fall winter fashion collection. And the reason why she's the sharpest tool in the shed is because she's very focused on diversity. And in an interview with The Hollywood Reporter, she said, and in terms of inclusivity, it doesn't feel like we're checking the boxes. It's so integrated. You see people of all different genders, and there doesn't need to be pomp and circumstance about it. So for her, it's about real, authentic inclusivity. It's not just surface level. It's not just for the likes and the shares. It's not in the article that I've got in front of me, but I actually heard Rihanna say in an interview about this new show that, and for someone that comes from like an intersectionality background that realizes that marginalization isn't just based on one aspect of your identity, and you also can't just, add discrimination, areas of discrimination onto each other, and they're not like cumulative. Someone like Rihanna, who doesn't necessarily come from a background, she just really seems to get it, which one might be able to understand since she's a woman of color. But she said that with diversity, it's never perfect. There's always someone that you're going to exclude. So I think this is maybe the second or the third time that she's run this show. Every year she does it. And so she said this year, and every time we do the show, we want to make sure that we are more inclusive than we were in the previous season. So I thought that was really nice to see Rihanna using her platform to, be inclusive and represent. So today, Rihanna is the Sharpest student that shared. Thanks, Rihanna.
Excellent, very good. And I think just briefly, that point around, even just thinking about who are we potentially excluding by trying to include others is a really important point for reflection. So to go back kind of to Rihanna as well is really useful in the sense of just having those conversations, exploring those moot points is a really good starting point. And for that to be in popular culture and to be in the media there is a lot of work still to be done, of course, around diversity and inclusion, and equality is far further away. But by having these conversations in a very mainstream public domain, that's really a step in the right direction.
It's nice to see that it's not just us boring academics, but the cool people are doing it too.
Absolutely, and I think that's testament to the fact that these are real societal issues, real societal problems that affect everybody in a vast multitude of ways. But these are problems that all of us will, certainly most of us, but I would argue all of us encounter in our daily lives.
Earlier today, I was scrolling through LinkedIn, and I saw one of our mutual colleagues who also works in the field of diversity, post something about the business case of diversity. And I'm just like, really?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's something that I reflect on relatively often as well. And I very much share your sentiment of like, really? But I wonder whether sometimes the language of inclusivity for equality is enough for some people to understand that discourse. And I'm not necessarily advocating the business case, but I think sometimes packaging the ideas of equality and diversity and inclusion in a way in which makes sense to different audiences can potentially be helpful. So but it is, I very much agree with you, there's a lot of it's a problematic discourse, and that there's a lot of tension there, and it's a question that I ask my students to sort of mull over as well, is are we doing equality and diversity work in organizations because morally it's the right thing to do, or are we doing it because it somehow has a positive effect on the bottom line? Because those two things are very, very different. Can they be reconciled? I think that again is a moot point as well. I mean, my personal view and the view that I advocate is that we have a moral obligation as citizens of the world and human beings to engage in these endeavors, rather than because it's somehow gonna benefit financially the organizations within which we find ourselves.
Other people don't have PhDs that focus on issues of diversity, things like intersectionality, inequality regime, stuff like that. People just don't know. So for someone like me to now take my morality stick and try to beat, because you must just do it because it's the right thing to do, that doesn't really help anyone, does it?
It's not going to work. It's not going to be effective, no. And it's almost sort of counter counterproductive in some respects. I think from my own experiences and my own work, I think it's not just about the kind of the packaging, but it's also about trying to understand the standpoint from which someone is coming, whether that's from a standpoint of marginalization or indeed privilege, and trying to think, how can I frame these ideas in a way that speaks to them and speaks to their experiences, so that there is some kind of literature around, informal literature around, saying to CEOs, how do you feel about if, for example, your daughter was working here and she was being paid 18% less than her male counterparts. Now, anecdotally, one would expect the response to be quite different to the question of, well, what are you going to do about the 18% gender pay gap that you have in your organization?
I think earlier on in my career, because diversity has always been close to my heart, but I sometimes find myself, and now with a little bit more maturity, I realized that I'm essentially being a bigot. Even though I might think I'm doing it for the right reasons, I am very much ideologically using the same rhetoric as people that enforce or reinforce and perpetuate marginalization. Is, I think my way is the right way, and that's just the only way to go about it. But empathy and understanding someone else's lived experiences is so important. Also an anecdotal evidence of this that I've seen, and I know that the United States is probably not the best example because it's very, very acute. Their division and their marginalization and division situation is quite intense. But I did see a video online. I don't read any news. Everything is on TikTok. There's a bunch of neo-Nazis protesting. I think it was a anti-racism rally or protest or something. And so there was a bunch of neo-Nazis, telling the protesters against racism that they're being whatever stupid.
What would you do if you were face to face with hatred? Would you yell? Would you punch? For Aaron Courtney, a high school football coach from Gainesville, Florida, the answer was hug. Courtney was on his way out from a protest against white nationalist Richard Spencer's speech at University of Florida when he spotted his chance to confront someone who hates his very existence. He just had one question. Oh, you don't like me! But Randy Furness, a neo-Nazi skinhead, didn't have an answer. Instead, he stared. I could have hit him. I could have hurt him, Courtney told the New York Daily News. But something in me said, you know what? He just needs love. That's when Courtney, taking his father's teaching as a bishop at heart, offered Furness a hug. And finally, he got an answer. I don't know.
And instead of punching him, which would have been justified, probably, he said, why don't you like me? And just that started a conversation because the Nazi couldn't tell him. He couldn't tell him why he doesn't like him. Because he's been in this bubble of just the same thing over and over. Black people are a certain way, white people are a certain way, and that's just it. When you're face to face with another person and you actually go, wow, my actions have an influence on that person's life, the conversation completely changes.
Yeah, absolutely. And that story is, of course, incredibly powerful. I think we do also need to just also make clear our own positionality as white people in that conversation as well, just to be absolutely clear and candid about that.
I am a white woman in ladies. America. Is there a problem here?
But that story very much reminded me of, and again, it's something I don't know where I read it or saw it, but when people in the First World War were confronted with each other in the trenches, to almost sort of directly kill each other one-on-one and many people couldn't do that because this isn't something that is necessarily
it's not just the enemy. It's a
differing worldviews, different ideologies. And when it comes down to two individuals, really finding themselves in that really intimate human moment, I think there's something absolutely fascinating.
So that's definitely, I think that's probably something that's lacking in the diversity field space, is empathy. And I will admit 100% that I'm definitely one of the people that is guilty of kind of taking a moral sort of, I'm morally superior because I know about diversity and I advocate for inclusion and all of that. But that's not really, I mean, at the end of the day, what we want is not the other person to admit that they're wrong. What we want is better diversity and inclusion.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, empathy is obviously a core part of emotional intelligence. And we're seeing now almost a kind of a huge growth around and focus on the importance of emotional intelligence. And I wonder whether in the long term that in itself, and emotional intelligence and emotionally intelligent leadership can have a positive effect on potentially on having those more inclusive conversations, and that in turn potentially can have a positive effect on diversity as well.
Am I hearing a potential research project?
Possibly, yes. There are always opportunities for
I just recorded another podcast with a friend who works, you know him, Alex, who works in venture capital and startups. We were talking about people in startups, people issues, and I have like 3 research projects that I wanted to do with him. So, Emily, back to our original point about diversity inclusion post-COVID. So when we briefly spoke before today, you mentioned that there is some kind of trend that's emerging, that there's focus has become, rebuilding, stabilizing, recovering, and diversity and inclusion is not necessarily part of that conversation. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that?
Absolutely, and I think so. What I'll do is sort of some of the data that I draw on in my mind is UK focused, but some of these patterns in terms of regression around equality, I tend to focus on gender equality. That's my core research focus as well. But these regressions that we're seeing appear to be at this moment in time also global trends as well. But from a UK perspective, what we're seeing, and what I would also say is that there is a lag in what we're seeing. So unfortunately, I anticipate that things will get worse before they get better. But what we're seeing is that women are disproportionately negatively affected economically, socioeconomically, and in terms of the labour market more broadly, in not just during COVID-19, but in this post-COVID-19 context within which we find ourselves. So what specifically do I mean by that? Things such as women are more likely to have been made redundant, women are more likely to find themselves in precarious forms of employment as well. Women are disproportionately represented in sectors that maybe saw closures or decline during the COVID-19 period. So what we're going to see is that sort of continuing on, and unfortunately that leads to regressions of equality. Importantly as well, with people being in the home, it is still disproportionately women who carry out the unpaid labour in the home, particularly around childcare as well.
And that's immediately what popped up when you said the burden of unpaid home responsibilities always falls to the woman, because now the nanny didn't show up. Both mom and dad works. Dad doesn't stay home and look after the baby, or dad doesn't take the baby to the office. mom has to look after the baby and manage a career as an executive coach. And so I also foresee, if we don't actively engage in making sure
in that status quo as well, and even just, we hear this all the time, oh, the school, if a child is sick. I mean, I'll be completely candid. I don't have children. I draw on anecdotes from friends and colleagues and from what I see myself. But, the status quo is, if a child is sick and needs to be picked up from school, who does the school call? Generally, it tends to be the mother.
And I also feel like
female caregiver.
Yeah, in those situations, you kind of assume, sure, it's the mother or the female partner, and then when she isn't available and you go for the dad, people are like super apologetic, like, oh my God, I'm so sorry that I had to take you from your busy corporate life. He's the kid's parent as much as the mother is. It's almost like it's not almost like, it is exactly like women are caregivers first and career people second. And that has a material impact on everything you mentioned.
Yeah, and I think during COVID-19, again, that's been further entrenched and just further pronounced, and that will take that imbalance will take so long to kind of change, and the rhetoric around that and people's experience of that, and what children are seeing. Will we see in 10-15 years these same patterns emerge again? I wouldn't like to kind of deliberate that or hypothesize it, but certainly we know that people's lived experiences of gender roles in the home and in society hugely shape the future.
So what can we do us as academics? And that's one of the reasons why I'm doing this podcast with clever people like yourself, is I think as academics, because we have such a set way of looking at the world and doing things and publishing and doing research, we often only report on the bad things and the trends, because that's how we do academia, right? You have a set agenda, you do your research, and you report on what you found. How can we advise companies to proactively avoid a regression in diversity, and instead of waiting 5 years down the line, look what it has done to my diversity?
Yeah.
What can we do now?
Yeah, fantastic question. So I guess what I would first say is that what we're looking for from organizations, and when I advise organizations or speak to organizations, either in a consulting capacity or in academic capacities, is thinking about being proactive rather than reactive. So your question's bang on in that sense. What can and should organizations, individual managers, and we as individuals be doing now rather than 3, 5, 10 years down the line? And I think it links back to this idea of emotional intelligence and empathy that we were talking about earlier in the first instance, is asking people, look, what is it that you need that we can do to help you in this scenario? What might some of the key roadblocks be for you? Having open conversations and fostering not only understanding, but also support in the organization. Now, one might argue that that's somehow idealistic and maybe slightly blind of some of the logistical constraints that we find in organizations, but really having the opportunity to have candid conversations as to how we can all help each other in organizations. I think it's still recording, Clifford. You're still on mute.
Am I back?
Yes.
Oh, sorry about that. I lost you for a sec, but we're still recording, right?
Yeah, that's
okay,
all
cool.
fine. So
sorry,
yeah,
I lost you when you were
those...
saying losing sight of the logistic issues of having empathy.
Yeah, so and really thinking, what as an organization can we do to support this person and the context within which they find themselves, both personally and professionally, to support them to do what they need to do, but also to try and deconstruct the status quo of, say, gendered caregiving, disproportionate caregiving by women for children, sick or elderly family members, and just saying, do you know what, there are different ways of doing these things, and we're going to support you fully in that journey. And I do genuinely think that a good starting point for that is about comes from having an open organizational culture that fosters meaningful and open conversations around diversity and inclusion. But of course, if you're coming from a starting point of not a very diverse organization, a very conservative organization, that's going to be more difficult. But that's also where you know, consultants can help, EDI specialists can help, experts can help us as well. But really, and also drawing reflexively on the learnings that I would hope many of us have had over the last 18 months or so, where actually we've seen that, do you know what, not everybody needs to be in the office from 8 till 6 Monday to Friday. People can dial in, children can be playing in the background, and it's not going to make or break the business. And just that idea of flexibility as well, and doing things a little bit differently. And I hope, and I remain hopeful, that despite all of the tragedy and pain and death that we've seen in the world during the COVID-19 pandemic, which is you know, truly awful, but that from a sort of organizational perspective, that maybe there has been something positive, and that there really are lots of learnings that we can make from this time. I think, you know, you mentioned earlier trying to keep it positive, and yes, you know, I certainly don't want to detract from the horror of the last while, but I think there's also scope for a lot of positive learning.
I think, yeah, you're spot on. I think one of the big things, and again, I just also have to preface, I luckily haven't had any significant losses or pain associated with COVID. So I know when we say the positives of COVID might be triggering for some people. So I'm not trying to detract from that in any way. But I will say that if anything positive did come from COVID that we can apply within the diversity space in organizations is this idea that if we try to do something differently, the world isn't going to collapse. Work isn't going to stop. The company isn't going to cease to exist. And you've mentioned a few times challenging the status quo. Challenging the status quo is key, and has always been key in diversity conversations. And I think more now than ever, you know, we now have evidence. Everyone has gone through this experience in varying degrees, but you can't dismiss the fact that if we do something differently, like, it will be okay. Just
exactly. And I think maybe, you know, again, in the context of an organization or an organizational setting, that, you know, it forced certain types of organizations to do things which they maybe they would have done, but maybe only in a few years' time, or they wouldn't have done at all. And I think in some respects, the pandemic has injected this need for more flexibility, but also, I think, organizational agility. And has brought out agility in organizations and certain managers and leaders that maybe they didn't know or think that they had inside them. So, and I think that's potentially a really positive thing. For
sure. So let's end it off on a positive note. Let's summarize all our great insights. So we said, listen. to listen to people's experiences. Just if anyone was watching up until this point and you didn't hear Emily say it earlier, I just want to reaffirm both Emily and I are acutely aware of our position as white middle-class people within the diversity space.
I am a white woman.
We don't believe that we know everything, and we definitely advocate for listening. So definitely listening to people's experiences, being open to change, making sure that you are, as you put it, agile. I think that's a good, albeit maybe a little bit buzzwordy, but it's definitely what we're saying in industry. So agility, listening. What was the other ones? Deconstructing the status quo. Just because we've been doing it a certain way doesn't mean we have to keep doing it. What else did I miss?
Caring about people's lived experience, which links into listening and having. The most important thing, I think, is empathy.
For sure. So Emily, I'm going to thank you. I'm going to let you back into building your impressive academic career. I thank you for your time. I feel very privileged for you sharing your insights. And if people want to cyberstalk you, where can they find you?
You can follow me. You are more than welcome to add me on LinkedIn, where you'll find me under Emily Yarrow, or you can follow me on Twitter at EmilyYarrow1. I'd be delighted to hear from people. You're more than welcome to follow me. And Clifford, thank you for inviting me onto your podcast today. And I look forward to hearing more about how it's all going.
Awesome, thanks. I'm available on all platforms, Twitter, Insta, TikTok, at Clif with 1F P Lewis. And that is us for today. And please join us for the next episode, where I will have either a family member or a smart family member or one of my other smart friends to share their insights with you. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.